Millionaire loses his arms in a tragic helicopter accident. Isolated in his mansion and sinking into despair, he never imagined that his housekeeper, a poor single mother struggling to support her daughter, would change his life in a way that no one could have predicted. What she did shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from for more incredible and moving stories. The vineyards of Napa Valley were bathed in a golden hue as the sun began to set. The grapes, plump and ripe, hung from the vines in perfect harmony, as if they understood the importance of the perfection that Richard Montgomery demanded. He walked among the rows, his impeccably tailored suit contrasting with the rural setting, his dark and piercing eyes examining each vine, each fruit, every detail that could compromise the quality of his award-winning wines. "This pruning is irregular. Redo this entire section," he ordered without raising his voice, but with a coldness that made the foreman pale. "Yes, Mr. Montgomery, it will be taken care of immediately." Richard didn't even wait for the full response. He turned on his heel and headed towards his mansion, located at the highest point of the property, from where he could observe the empire he had expanded. Montgomery Vineyards was not only the largest in California, it was an international benchmark, a legacy that his father had started, but that he had transformed into something far beyond expectations. At 38, Richard Montgomery was what many would call a success story. The man who modernized processes, conquered international markets, and doubled the company's value in less than a decade. His austerity and perfectionism were legendary in the business world. "Richard doesn't tolerate mistakes," that's what they said, and he cultivated that reputation with pride. In the enormous living room of the mansion, with its large windows that framed the vineyards like works of art, Richard found Ashley Van der Linde, his fiancée of 2 years. Beautiful, sophisticated, the daughter of one of the most traditional families in New York high society, Ashley represented the perfect alliance, social, commercial, and strategic. She was flipping through a wedding magazine with a glass of red wine in her delicate hands. "How was the meeting with the French?" she asked, without looking up from the magazine. "Productive. They will distribute the new vintage throughout Europe," Richard replied, pouring himself a generous dose of his award-winning wine. "We closed an exclusive 5-year contract." "Wonderful, darling." Ashley smiled, that studied smile that never reached her eyes. "Speaking of our wedding, I was thinking of postponing it for another 6 months. The decorator I want is fully booked, and it would be terrible to have an event that isn't absolutely perfect, wouldn't it?" Richard nodded indifferently. The wedding for him was just another contract, another strategic acquisition in his meticulously planned life. "As you wish," he replied, checking messages on his cell phone. "Just let me know in advance so I can reorganize my schedule." The dialogue died there, like most of their conversations. There was no warmth, no genuine intimacy. To an outside observer, they could be two cordial strangers sharing the same space. Richard didn't mind it. Loneliness was a familiar companion, something he had learned to accept since childhood, when his father taught him that feelings were weaknesses that hindered business. The next morning, the sky dawned full of grey clouds. Richard, up since 5 in the morning, watched the changing weather from his large suite. There was an important meeting with new investors on a nearby property, and he was already perfectly dressed, his Italian silk tie adjusted with millimeter precision. "Sir, the helicopter is ready," announced Maria Rodriguez, entering the room silently after a brief knock on the door. Maria had worked for Richard for over 10 years. She was a 32-year-old woman with hazel eyes that seemed to hold secrets and sorrows. Always discreet, efficient, and punctual, Maria raised her daughter Sophia, 7 years old, on her own, a bright and curious child who sometimes appeared at the mansion on days when she didn't have school. Richard barely noticed Maria's presence beyond her efficiency. She was like a well-oiled gear in his controlled universe. "Thank you, Maria. I'm coming down," he replied without looking at her directly. Richard descended the marble staircase, passed through the spacious hall decorated with expensive works of art that he had never really admired, and went out to the impeccably manicured garden. The helicopter awaited him, its blades already in motion, cutting through the humid morning air. As he boarded, Richard couldn't have known that this would be the last time he would walk through that garden on his own legs, that he would use his own hands to adjust his shirt collar, that he would be the man he had always been. He couldn't have known that, in a matter of minutes, his life would be completely shattered, like a crystal glass falling on marble. The helicopter took off, ascending rapidly over the vineyards that stretched out like an undulating green carpet. Richard watched his property from above, feeling that pang of pride that was perhaps the only genuine emotion he allowed himself. It was then that he heard a strange sound, a metallic crash, followed by a persistent alarm. "Mr. Montgomery, we have a problem," the pilot announced, his voice tense. "A mechanical failure. We're losing altitude. I'm going to attempt an emergency landing." There was no time for further explanation. The helicopter began to spin uncontrollably, falling in a spiral. Richard felt his stomach churn, his hands gripping the seatbelt tightly. His calculating mind, which always found solutions for everything, was now blank, dominated by pure terror. The impact was violent: twisted metal, shattered glass, the smell of fuel and earth. Richard had only a glimpse of his vineyards destroyed by the fall before darkness completely engulfed him. The world returned in confused flashes. Two bright white lights, distant voices, pain, an unbearable pain that seemed to engulf his entire body. Richard tried to move, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. "Mr. Montgomery, can you hear me?" A female voice, professional. "I'm Dr. Lewis. You're at St. Jude's Hospital. You've been in a serious accident." Richard tried to speak, but his throat was dry. When he finally managed to focus his vision, he saw a middle-aged doctor next to his bed. "The pilot?" he managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry, he didn't survive," the doctor replied in a controlled tone. "Mr. Montgomery, I need to explain the extent of your injuries." It was then that Richard looked down, and the world seemed to collapse again. Where there should have been arms, there were only bandages. A wave of nausea washed over him, and he closed his eyes tightly, as if he could erase that vision. "Due to the impact and the wreckage, it was not possible to save your arms," the doctor explained, her voice now softer. "We did everything we could. With physical therapy and modern prosthetics, you will be able to regain much of your independence, but—" Richard was no longer listening. His mind was in shock, unable to process the reality that was now being forced upon him. Richard Montgomery, the man who controlled everything and everyone, now couldn't even bring a glass of water to his mouth. It was a cruel joke, an absurd inversion of everything his life represented. The days in the hospital dragged on in a haze of medication, pain, and silent despair. Richard refused to see any of his executives, ignored attempts to contact him, and even rejected visits from the doctor responsible for his rehabilitation. What was the point? What kind of life awaited him now? On the third day, Ashley appeared. She was impeccably dressed and made up, as if she were going to a social gathering and not visiting her hospitalized fiancé. She brought flowers, expensive orchids, which she placed on the table without much care. "Richard, what a terrible situation," she said, keeping a calculated distance from the bed. Her eyes avoided looking directly at the bandaged stumps. "Everyone is talking. Worried. The board is in a panic about the future of the company." "The board can go to hell," Richard replied, his voice rough from not having spoken much in recent days. "And you, Ashley? Are you also worried about the future of the company, or about the fact that your fiancé has become an invalid?" Ashley seemed uncomfortable for the first time. She adjusted the strap of her designer handbag and attempted a smile that wouldn't convince anyone. "Don't be unfair, Richard. I'm here, aren't I? But you need to understand that this—" She gestured vaguely in his direction. "This changes a lot of things. We need to be practical." "Practical," he repeated, with a dry laugh that sounded like paper being torn. Yes, we've always been practical, haven't we? There was never any real love between us, just convenience. Get out of here, Ashley. I understand the message. She didn't protest much. 3 days later, Richard received a message on his cell phone, read by a nurse at his request. Ashley was ending the engagement, explaining that she didn't have the emotional strength to deal with the situation, and that being tied to someone disabled would be detrimental to both of them. There was a note of false compassion in the subtext that made Richard feel nauseous. After 2 weeks of hospitalization, the doctors agreed that he could continue his recovery at home with constant monitoring. Richard was transported to his mansion, now feeling it as a prison rather than the symbol of power it had always been. The return home was a new nightmare. Every corner, every object reminded him of the life he had lost. The majestic staircase that he now needed help climbing, the books he could no longer browse, the glasses of wine he couldn't raise. His employees seemed terrified, as if his condition were contagious. "Leave me alone," he shouted after a butler dropped a glass of water while trying to help him. "All of you, get out." In a few days, the mansion was almost deserted. Employees resigned or invented excuses not to attend to him directly. Only Maria remained steadfast, ignoring his rages, cleaning up what he spilled, feeding him when he refused to try to use the adapted cutlery. "Why are you still here?" he asked her one afternoon, as she opened the curtains in the room, letting in the light he was trying to avoid. "Everyone has already fled this sinking ship." Maria turned to him, her hazel eyes calm, without the fear or pity he saw in everyone else. "I'm here because this is my job, Mr. Montgomery, and because I need to support my daughter." The raw honesty of the answer surprised him. There was no falseness there, no pretense of nobility or compassion. It was pure pragmatism. She needed the job. He needed someone who didn't treat him like a broken monster. "At least you're honest," he murmured, and for the first time in weeks, there wasn't only bitterness in his voice. It was on a Sunday afternoon that Sophia appeared for the first time after the accident. Maria was in the kitchen preparing soup, and the girl escaped her supervision, curiously climbing the stairs to the room where Richard spent most of his days. Sophia, with her big dark eyes framed by unruly brown curls, entered the room without knocking, childhood innocence ignoring social conventions. Richard was sitting by the window, watching the vineyards with empty eyes. Hearing light footsteps, he turned, surprised to see the child. "What are you doing here?" he asked, more confused than angry. Sophia approached without hesitation, her eyes fixed on the empty sleeves of Richard's shirt, where his arms would normally be. "Mommy said you got hurt," she replied simply, "that you don't have arms anymore. Does it hurt?" The direct question, without the embarrassment that adults showed, caught Richard off guard. For an instant, all his anger and bitterness dissipated, replaced by a strange vulnerability. "Sometimes," he replied, surprising himself with the honesty. "Doctors call it phantom pain. It feels like my arms are still there, hurting." Sophia nodded seriously, as if she understood perfectly. "My baby tooth fell out last month, and I still felt it there sometimes," she confided. "Is it like that?" Richard almost smiled at the innocent comparison. "Something like that, only worse." The girl was silent for a moment, watching him with that intensity that only children can have. "Do you want to see my drawing?" she asked suddenly, taking a folded paper from the pocket of her floral dress. "I did it at school. It's a unicorn dragon. I invented it." Before Richard could answer, Sophia had already unfolded the paper and was holding it out to him. It was a colorful and chaotic drawing with a creature that had a horn, wings, and breathed fire. "It's interesting," said Richard, unsure how to react to that unexpected normalcy. "You can keep it," Sophia declared, placing the drawing on Richard's lap. "Mummy says pretty things make us feel better when we're sad." At that moment, Maria appeared at the door, alarmed. "Sophia, you shouldn't be here bothering Mr. Montgomery," she said, entering quickly. "I'm sorry, sir, she escaped while I was preparing dinner." "It's okay," Richard replied, surprising both Maria and himself. "She's not bothering me." Clara took Sophia by the hand, still apologizing, and led the girl away. But something had changed in those brief minutes. Richard looked at the colorful drawing in his lap, and for the first time since the accident, felt a small warmth inside his chest. It wasn't hope, not yet, but perhaps the first step towards emerging from the abyss of self-pity into which he had plunged. In the following weeks, Sophia started appearing more often. Clara, realizing that her daughter's presence seemed to have a positive effect on her employer, allowed these brief visits, always supervised from a distance. The girl brought drawings, told stories from school, asked impossible questions as only children can. "Why don't you use those robot arms I saw on TV?" she asked one day, sitting on the rug in the room while Richard watched from the armchair. "Prosthetics," he corrected, "and I tried. They didn't work well for me." The truth was that Richard had rejected the prosthetics after only 2 adaptation sessions. The frustration of not being able to perform simple tasks, the feeling of being less than he was before, were too much for his wounded pride. "Did you give up?" Sophia questioned, the innocence of the question carrying a weight she didn't understand. "I didn't give up," Richard replied defensively. "I just didn't see a purpose in continuing." Sophia frowned, processing the information with the simple logic of a child. "But how are you going to hold things without arms? Mommy says we shouldn't give up on hard things. She never gives up, even when she's very tired." The words hit Richard like a slap in the face. Sophia's pure and direct perspective highlighted how much he had given in to self-pity. He, who had never accepted failures from his employees, had simply given up on himself. "Your mother seems to be a wise woman," he said finally, observing the girl with new eyes. "She's the best mom in the world," Sophia declared with absolute conviction. "She works hard to give me everything, and she knows how to make the best chocolate cake in the universe." Richard smiled, a movement almost forgotten by his facial muscles. "I imagine so." That night, for the first time in months, Richard asked Clara to serve dinner in the dining room, not in his room. When she arrived with the tray, she found him sitting at the head of the long, noble wood table where he used to hold business dinners. "I would like you and Sophia to have dinner with me tonight," he said, surprising Clara. "Sir?" "Please, Clara. It would be nice to have company." Clara hesitated but eventually accepted. She called Sophia, who jumped for joy at the invitation. During dinner, Richard watched mother and daughter interacting. Clara's care in cutting the meat for Sophia, the way the girl excitedly told about her day at school, the mother's restrained laughter at her daughter's stories. It was a glimpse into a way of life he had never experienced, a life filled with small everyday joys, of genuine connections. The next morning, Richard asked Clara to call the rehabilitation center. He was ready to try again. The process of adapting to the prosthetics was brutal. Each session left Richard exhausted, frustrated, and often on the verge of tears he refused to shed. The myoelectric prosthetics, the most advanced available, responded to the muscle impulses in his stumps, but fine control was almost impossible. Holding a glass without breaking or dropping it had become a monumental challenge. "This is useless," he exploded one afternoon after several failed attempts to button a shirt. The prosthetic simply didn't have the dexterity needed to manipulate something as small as a button. "You're making progress," insisted the occupational therapist, a patient woman who seemed immune to his rages. "Every little step counts." "Little steps?" Richard laughed bitterly. "I used to run a multinational company, signed million-dollar contracts. Now I'm celebrating because I managed to hold a damn spoon without dropping it." It was at that moment that he noticed Sophia standing in the doorway of the rehabilitation room he had installed in his mansion. Clara had brought her after school, as she had been doing regularly. The girl watched the scene with attentive and worried eyes. "Sophia, you shouldn't be here," Richard said, trying to control the frustration in his voice. But instead of walking away, Sophia approached, observing the metallic prosthetics that replaced his arms. They look like superhero arms, she commented, gently touching the polished metal. Richard felt a lump in his throat. Superhero. Was that how she saw him? I'm not a superhero, Sophia. I can barely button a shirt. Sophia tilted her head, considering the problem. I can help you, she offered simply. Mommy taught me how to button my shirts. It's easy. Before Richard could protest, Sophia was already in front of him, focused on the task of buttoning his shirt. Her small fingers worked carefully, and she bit her lower lip in concentration. See, she said proudly when she finished, it's not so hard. You'll learn too, but in the meantime, I'll help you. The occupational therapist, observing the scene, smiled discreetly. I think we'll wrap up for today, she said, gathering her equipment. Continue practicing the exercises I taught you, Mr. Montgomery. After the therapist left, Richard remained seated, observing the prosthetics that were now part of his body. Sophia had settled into a nearby chair and was drawing quietly. Sophia, he called after a few minutes of silence. Thank you for your help. The girl looked up from the drawing and smiled, a luminous smile that seemed to illuminate the entire room. You're welcome. Friends help each other, don't they? Friends. The word echoed in Richard's mind. When was the last time he had a true friend? Someone who wasn't interested in his money, his influence, or his power? Someone who saw him simply as a person, not as the powerful Richard Montgomery? That night, Richard asked Clara to serve dinner again in the dining room, for the three of them. It was becoming a habit, these shared meals. Sophia talked non-stop, telling stories from school, asking questions about the vineyards, about how wine was made. Clara, initially uncomfortable with the unusual situation, gradually relaxed, allowing herself to smile more, to contribute to the conversation. How did you come to work here, Clara? Richard asked during dessert, realizing that despite 10 years of working together, he knew almost nothing about her. Clara seemed surprised by the sudden interest. It was shortly after Sophia was born, she replied, helping her daughter cut a slice of pie. I worked at a diner downtown, but with a baby, the hours were impossible. I heard you were looking for a housekeeper and I applied. To be honest, I didn't think I'd be accepted, but your father liked my honesty during the interview. My father hired you? Richard frowned, surprised. His father rarely got involved with household matters. Yes. He said you needed someone who wasn't afraid to tell the truth, even if it was inconvenient. Clara smiled slightly. Apparently, my resume was too modest for the position, but my attitude impressed him. Richard nodded slowly. That sounded like his father, valuing straightforward, no-nonsense people, a quality he himself had adopted in business, but had never applied in personal relationships. And Sophia's father? The question escaped before he could think better of it. Forgive me, that's none of my business. Clara hesitated, her eyes meeting her daughter's for a brief moment. He's not in the picture, she replied simply. He chose to go another way when he found out about the pregnancy. Sophia, who had been quiet during this exchange, added, We don't need him. We have each other, don't we, Mom? Clara smiled, stroking her daughter's hair. Exactly, my love. Richard watched the exchange of glances between mother and daughter, feeling a strange pang in his chest. There was a bond there that he had never experienced, not with his own father, always distant and critical, nor with his mother, who had passed away when he was still very young. That complicity, that certainty of belonging, was completely foreign to his experience. In the following weeks, Richard plunged with renewed determination into his rehabilitation. It was no longer just about regaining independence. It was about proving to himself that he could overcome limitations, that he wasn't destined to be just a shadow of the man he had been. And, somehow, it was also about not disappointing Sophia, who watched him with those eyes full of innocent admiration. The progress was slow, painfully slow. But every small achievement, managing to hold a pen, bringing a fork to his mouth without dropping food, using the TV remote, was celebrated by Sophia as if it were an Olympic victory. And little by little, Richard began to see these achievements through her eyes, not as crumbs from a lost life, but as steps towards a new way of existing. It was Clara who suggested that he return to visit the vineyards. "Staying locked up in this house isn't doing you any good," she said one morning, while helping him adjust his prosthetics. "The fresh air and sunshine would do you good, and the employees need to see that you're still in charge." "In charge?" Richard laughed humorlessly. "I'm not even in charge of my own body, Clara. How am I going to run a company?" Clara stared at him with that frankness that he was learning to appreciate. "With your mind and your voice, Mr. Montgomery. They still work perfectly from what I can tell." The observation, direct and without pity, provoked a reluctant smile in Richard. "Have you always been this frank with your employers?" "Only with those who seem to need to hear the truth," she replied with a slight smile on her lips. That afternoon, Richard allowed Clara to lead him through the vineyards. It was autumn, and the leaves of the vines were taking on golden and reddish hues. The air had the characteristic aroma of damp earth and ripe grapes. Employees were working on the harvest, and Richard noticed how they tensed up when they spotted him, as if they didn't know how to react to the presence of the now so changed boss. Mr. Montgomery, Robert, the chief winemaker, approached hesitantly. "It's good to see you. We were just discussing the acidity of the grapes in this sector." Richard realized that Robert avoided looking at his prosthetics, keeping his eyes fixed on his face in an artificial way. "What's the problem, Robert?" he asked, surprising himself with the genuine interest he felt. How long had it been since he thought about the winery beyond the financial issues? Robert seemed relieved by the technical question and began to explain about the unusual weather conditions of that year and how they were affecting the development of the fruits. Richard listened attentively, asking questions, suggesting adjustments. For a moment, he forgot his limitations, immersed in the complexities of winemaking that had always fascinated the deepest part of his being. "Your suggestion makes sense," agreed Robert after a long discussion. "We will implement it immediately." When they returned to the mansion, Clara noticed a subtle change in Richard. There was a glimmer in his eyes that had been absent for months, a renewed energy in his posture. "Thank you for the walk," he said when they arrived. "It was revitalizing." "You seem more alive," Clara observed. "The vineyards have always had that effect on you, even before the accident. Sometimes I watched you walking among the vines when you thought no one was looking. It was the only time I saw you really relaxed." Richard looked at her, surprised by the so personal observation. "You noticed that?" "It's my job to notice things, Mr. Montgomery," she replied simply. "And yes, I always found it fascinating how the powerful and intimidating man from the boardrooms transformed among the vineyards." Something changed at that moment between them. A mutual recognition, an understanding that went beyond the employer-employee relationship. Richard saw Clara not only as the efficient woman who kept his house running, but as a perceptive observer, someone who saw beyond appearances. "Clara," he began, uncertain of how to express what he felt, "I never properly thanked you for everything you've done since the accident. Not just the physical work, but also for not giving up on me when I myself had already given up." Clara lowered her gaze, a slight blush tinging her cheeks. "It's my job, Mr. Montgomery." "No," Richard shook his head. "It's not just work. Anyone else would have resigned after the first vase I smashed against the wall. You stayed. You allowed Sophia to get close to me, even when I was difficult." Clara raised her eyes, meeting Richard's with an intensity he had never noticed before. "You've always been fair to me, even in the most difficult times. And Sophia—" A smile softened her features. "Sophia always had a special fondness for you, even before. She used to say that you were like the princes in fairy tales, only without the smile." Richard laughed, a genuine sound that seemed strange, even to his own ears. A prince without a smile, and now without arms. What a terrible fairy tale that would be. "It depends on the story you choose to tell, doesn't it?" Clara replied, with a wisdom that surprised him. In the best stories, the prince needs to face trials to become who he's truly meant to be. Inspired by the visit to the vineyards and the conversation with Clara, Richard decided to gradually get involved with the business again. He started with small meetings at home, using a room that he adapted as an office on the ground floor of the mansion. The executives, initially uncomfortable, got used to his new appearance and the prosthetics that were now a part of him. The real test came when a group of Italian investors, crucial partners for the winery's international expansion, requested a meeting. Richard had avoided encounters with people outside his immediate circle, fearing judgment, pity, or worse, contempt for his condition. "I'm not ready," he admitted to Clara the night before the meeting, as she helped organize the documents he would need. "You're more than ready," she replied firmly. "Your knowledge and vision for the company haven't changed. Your negotiation skills are still intact. But how am I going to look trustworthy like this?" he questioned, raising his prosthetics. "Business is based on perception, Clara. No one trusts a broken man." Clara stopped what she was doing and stared at him directly. "You're not broken, you're different, and different doesn't mean less. Show them that your mind, your determination, and your passion for what you do are stronger than ever. That's what matters." Clara's words accompanied him the next day when he received the investors in the meeting room of the mansion. Richard had rehearsed how to use the prosthetics to turn pages, hold a pen to sign documents, gesture during explanations. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional, enough to conduct the meeting with dignity. At first, he noticed the looks of surprise and the tension in the air. But, as the discussion moved to technical and strategic issues, he noticed a change. The investors began to focus on his ideas, not on his physical limitations. When Richard explained the innovations he planned to implement in the fermentation processes, he saw the respect grow in their eyes. The meeting was a success. The contract was renewed with even more favorable terms. When the investors left, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in months: pride. Sophia was waiting anxiously in the kitchen, where Clara was preparing dinner. "How did it go, Uncle Richard?" she asked, using the affectionate term she'd recently adopted. "Did you show them your superpowers?" Richard smiled, ruffling the girl's hair with one of the prosthetics, a gesture he had practiced tirelessly for moments like this. "I think so, kiddo. And do you know who helped me find those superpowers? You and your mom." Clara, who was watching the scene while chopping vegetables, felt a warmth spread through her chest. Seeing Richard, the man who had come so close to losing himself completely in his pain, now playing with her daughter, regaining control of his life, was a vision that warmed her soul in a way she hadn't expected. The following weeks brought a surprisingly comfortable routine for the three. Richard went back to work regularly, although at a reduced pace and with many adaptations. Clara, in addition to her usual duties, had become a kind of personal assistant, helping him with documents, schedules, and correspondence. And Sophia, who now spent more time at the mansion, had become a bright and constant presence, bringing laughter to a place that had long not known it. It was during this period that Richard realized the transformation that was taking place within him. For the first time in his adult life, he was forming genuine connections, not based on power, money, or influence, but on something much more valuable: mutual understanding, respect, and affection. With Clara, he developed a partnership that went beyond the professional relationship. They talked for hours about the most diverse subjects, from the challenges of winemaking to the difficulties of raising a child alone. Richard discovered in Clara a sharp intelligence and a practical wisdom that had always been there, just waiting to be noticed. And as for Sophia, the girl had won a special place in his heart. Her endless curiosity, her unconditional acceptance, and her ability to find joy in the simplest things were daily lessons for Richard. He found himself eager to hear her stories from school, to see her new drawings, to answer her endless questions about how the world worked. "Uncle Richard, why are the grapes for red wine dark, but white wine comes from light grapes?" she asked one afternoon, while they were walking through the vineyards, a walk that had become frequent. "Actually, Sophia, White wine can even be made with dark grapes, he explained patiently. It's the process that makes the difference. In red wine, the juice ferments with the skins. In white wine, the skins are removed before fermentation. Like making orange juice, she exclaimed, making the connection. We only squeeze the inside without the peel. Exactly, Richard smiled, impressed with the simple but accurate analogy. You'd make a great winemaker someday. Sophia's eyes sparkled with the possibility. Could I work with you when I grow up? Make wines? The question, asked with childish simplicity, touched Richard deeply. The idea of a shared future, of leaving a legacy not only of successful businesses, but of knowledge and passion passed on to the next generation, was something he had never considered. It would be an honor to have you as my apprentice, Sophia, he replied sincerely. Autumn gave way to winter, and the mansion prepared for the holiday festivities. For the first time in many years, Richard felt a desire to celebrate. He ordered the house to be decorated, invited his closest executives and their families for a Christmas party, something he would never have done before the accident. You've really changed, commented Clara, while helping to plan the event. Before, Christmas was just another day for you. I was a fool before, replied Richard, looking out the window at the vineyards covered by a thin layer of morning frost. I wasted so much time chasing things that in the end didn't mean anything. It depends on the story you choose to tell, doesn't it? Clara replied, with a wisdom that surprised him. In the best stories, the prince needs to face trials to become who he's truly meant to be. Clara watched him for a moment, noticing how his posture had changed in recent months. He seemed more relaxed, more present. The tense lines around his eyes had softened, and his smile, once rare, now appeared frequently. It was as if the accident, with all its brutality, had broken not only his body, but also the hard shell that surrounded his heart. You weren't a fool, Clara said softly. You were just following the path you knew. Richard turned to face her, touched by the gentleness of her words. You always manage to see the best in people, don't you, Clara? Not in everyone, she smiled slightly, but in you, yes. I always saw something beyond the stern businessman that everyone feared. The moment was interrupted by Sophia, who came running into the room, brandishing a piece of paper. Uncle Richard, look what I drew for Christmas. The drawing showed 3 figures holding hands in front of a Christmas tree, a small figure in the middle, and 2 larger ones on the sides. A makeshift family, united not by blood, but by something equally strong. The Christmas party was a milestone. Employees who before barely dared to look directly at Richard now chatted animatedly with him. Sophia charmed everyone with her vibrant personality, and Clara, wearing a simple but elegant dress chosen especially for the occasion, attracted admiring glances, including Richard's, who realized perhaps for the first time how truly beautiful she was. It was during this party that Richard made a decision that would change the course of his company. He gathered his top executives and announced that he would implement a program to support rural workers with physical disabilities, offering not only adapted jobs, but also developing specialized prosthetics for agricultural work. My personal experience has shown me that there are unnecessary barriers for people with disabilities, he explained. I want Montgomery Vineyards to be a pioneer in breaking down these barriers. The initiative was received with enthusiasm and respect. Richard realized that his personal tragedy could be transformed into something positive, that he could use his influence and resources to make a difference in the lives of people facing challenges similar to his. The start of the new year brought new challenges. The implementation of the inclusion program required structural changes in the company, and not everyone was willing to follow this new direction. Some shareholders expressed concern, questioning whether Richard was emotionally stable to lead the company after the traumatic accident. They're requesting a special board meeting, informed Robert, now his right-hand man in the company. They want to vote on your tenure as CEO. Richard received the news with surprising calm. 6 months earlier, he would have reacted with fury, seeing this as an unforgivable betrayal. Now he understood that it was just business, and that he would need to prove his worth again. "Schedule the meeting," he replied, "and prepare a complete presentation on our financial results for the last 3 months and the projections for the inclusion program." On the night before the crucial meeting, Richard was in the office of the mansion, reviewing documents and practicing his presentation. Clara entered silently with a tray of tea. "You should rest," she suggested, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "Tomorrow will be an important day." "I need to be prepared, Clara. They think I'm weakened, that my decisions are based on emotions, not on business logic." Clara placed the tray on the table and allowed herself a moment of boldness, touching Richard's shoulder lightly. "What if they're both? You've always been brilliant in business, Richard, but now you also understand the human side of things. That's not weakness, it's a strength that few leaders possess." The intimacy of the gesture and the use of his first name did not go unnoticed by Richard. He raised his eyes, meeting Clara's warm gaze. "Do you really believe that?" "With all my heart," she replied simply. Something passed between them at that moment, an invisible current of understanding and affection that went far beyond the professional relationship they had maintained for so long. Richard felt an almost irresistible urge to get closer, to explore this new emotional territory he was discovering. But the moment was interrupted by a distant thunderclap, followed by the sound of heavy rain beginning to fall. "Looks like we're in for a storm," commented Clara, withdrawing her hand from his shoulder and resuming her professional posture. "I'll check if all the windows are closed." She withdrew, leaving Richard with confused thoughts and emotions he didn't know how to process. What was happening between them? Was it just gratitude on his part, mistaken for something deeper? And Clara? Was she just being kind and supportive, as she always had been? The storm intensified during the night. Richard couldn't sleep, thinking about the meeting the next day, and also about the newfound feelings that stirred in his heart. Around 3 in the morning, a loud noise woke him from his restless nap. The security alarm of the vineyards. "Mr. Montgomery," the urgent voice of Joaquin, the night watchman, sounded through the intercom. "The storm knocked down part of the support structure in the eastern sector. We're trying to contain the damage, but we need more people." Richard got up quickly, dressing with difficulty, but with the renewed determination he had developed in recent months. When he went downstairs, he found Clara already awake, wearing a waterproof coat over her pajamas. "I'm going with you," she declared, in a tone that didn't allow discussion. "I've already called for backup. They should arrive in 20 minutes. "It's dangerous, Clara," Richard protested. "Stay with Sophia. Sophia is sleeping soundly. I called my neighbor to come and stay with her. You can't go alone in this storm, especially—" She hesitated. "Especially without arms, you mean?" completed Richard without resentment. It was just a fact, a reality he had learned to live with. "You're right. Let's go together then." The scene in the vineyards was chaotic. The strong wind had knocked down part of the metal structure that supported the younger vines recently planted in the autumn. Employees ran from one side to the other, trying to save what they could under the torrential rain. Richard immediately took command, directing teams, prioritizing areas, keeping calm when everyone around seemed on the verge of panic. Clara remained by his side, serving as his arms when necessary, translating his orders into concrete actions. It was in the midst of this chaos that Sophia appeared. The girl, frightened by the storm, had woken up and, not finding her mother, followed the lights and the movement to the vineyards. "Mom! Uncle Richard!" she shouted, her small voice almost lost in the roar of the storm. Clara turned, horrified to see her daughter alone in the midst of the confusion. At the same instant, a loud crash announced that another part of the metal structure was giving way, exactly in Sophia's direction. Richard reacted by pure instinct. Without thinking about the consequences or his own limitations, he ran towards the girl. With a strength he didn't know he possessed, he pushed Sophia away from danger, using his own body as a shield. The structure collapsed with a deafening crash. When Clara arrived seconds later, she found Sophia frightened but unharmed. Richard, however, was lying on the ground, one of his prosthetics crushed under the metal structure, and blood running from a deep cut on his forehead. "Richard!" she cried, abandoning all formality, the panic evident in her voice. "Someone call an ambulance, now!" The following minutes were a blur of frantic activity. Employees working to free Richard from the rubble, Clara holding his good hand and speaking words of encouragement, Sophia crying, apologizing repeatedly for causing the accident. The last thing Richard saw before losing consciousness was Clara's face, wet with rain and tears, her amber eyes filled with an emotion he finally recognized as love. Richard woke up in the hospital for what seemed to be the second time in his new life. But this time, when he opened his eyes, he wasn't alone. Clara slept uncomfortably in a chair next to the bed, and Sophia was curled up in her mother's lap, also asleep. He watched the two of them for a moment, feeling a wave of tenderness so intense that it almost hurt. When had he started to love them? When had they become as essential to his existence as the air he breathed? Clara woke up, her eyes meeting his immediately. The relief on her face was palpable. "You're awake," she whispered, so as not to wake Sophia. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been run over by a tractor," he replied with a small smile. "What happened after I passed out?" Clara adjusted Sophia in a more comfortable position before answering. "Your right prosthetic was completely destroyed. The doctor said you'll have to use a temporary one until a new one is made. You have a mild concussion and some cuts, but nothing serious. You saved her life, Richard." Clara's voice faltered on the last sentence, and Richard saw tears forming in her eyes. "I didn't think," he admitted. "I saw the danger and just acted." "That's what parents do," Clara replied softly. "They protect their children without thinking twice." The words reverberated deeply in Richard. Parents, children. He had never thought of himself as a father figure to Sophia, but he realized that was exactly how he felt about the girl. And as for Clara, what he felt for her went far beyond admiration or gratitude. "Clara, he began, uncertain of how to express the complex feelings that flooded him. At that moment, Sophia woke up, her eyes widening when she saw Richard conscious. "Uncle Richard!" she exclaimed, jumping out of her mother's lap and approaching the bed carefully. "You saved my life. You really are a superhero." Richard smiled, touched by the child's innocent admiration. "I just did what anyone would do, kiddo." "No!" Sophia shook her head emphatically. "You're special. You're my hero." The simple and sincere declaration touched Richard more deeply than any praise he had ever received in his life of successes. The recovery in the hospital lasted only 2 days, but it was enough for Richard to miss the crucial board meeting. To his surprise, Robert informed him that the meeting had been postponed. "The shareholders found out what happened in the vineyards," he explained. "The story of how you risked your life to save your housekeeper's daughter spread quickly. They're impressed." Richard laughed, shaking his head slightly. "So all it took was an impulsive act to convince them that I'm still capable?" "It wasn't just that," Robert smiled. "In recent weeks, many have realized that the company is stronger under your new leadership, more human, more innovative, and the financial results don't lie. We're having one of the best quarters in the winery's history." Back at the mansion, Richard faced the challenge of adapting again, now with only one functional prosthetic until the new one arrived. But this time, there was no despair or self-pity. There was a clear purpose in his mind, a renewed determination not only to regain control of his life, but to transform it into something more meaningful. The board meeting, when it finally happened, was a formality. The shareholders not only approved his tenure as CEO, but also his ambitious social inclusion plan. Montgomery Vineyards was about to become an example of how companies could be profitable and socially responsible at the same time. That night, Richard asked Clara to join him after dinner for a conversation on the terrace. The starry sky of Napa Valley shone above them, and the soft breeze carried the aroma of the vineyards. "Clara," he began, nervous as a teenager on his first date, "these last months have changed my life in ways I never imagined possible, and you and Sophia are the biggest part of that change." Clara watched him in silence, her eyes reflecting the stars above. "In the beginning, I thought I had lost everything," continued Richard. "My arms, my independence, my identity. But now I realize that I only lost what wasn't essential, and I found what really matters." He took a step towards her, his heart racing. "Clara, I've fallen in love with you. With your strength, your honesty, your kindness, and with Sophia too, for her joy and innocence. You've taught me what it means to really live, to really love." Silent tears streamed down Clara's face as she listened to the words she never expected to hear. "I love you too, Richard," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I think I've loved you for a long time, even before the accident, but I never imagined that I could feel the same," he completed, with a sad smile. "The man I was before wouldn't have been capable of it, you're right. I had to lose my arms to open my heart." Clara approached, gently touching his face with her fingertips. "That's not how I see it. The man you are has always been there, just waiting for the opportunity to emerge. The kiss they shared under the stars was the beginning of a new chapter. It wasn't easy. There were prejudices to face, adjustments to make, a whole world of expectations to overcome. But together, they built something neither of them had experienced before, a family based on genuine love, mutual respect, and unconditional acceptance. 6 months later, Richard surprised everyone by announcing a complete restructuring of the company. Montgomery Vineyards would not only be a wine producer, but also a research and development center for assistive technologies for rural workers with disabilities. A significant portion of the profits would be directed to this new division. "Some have called me crazy," he said during the official announcement, with Clara and Sophia by his side. "Others have suggested that I'm letting emotions cloud my business judgment, but I've learned that it's precisely emotions, the right ones, that make us better leaders, better people." The first project developed was a specialized prosthetic for farm workers, allowing specific movements necessary for pruning and harvesting. Richard was the first to test it, working side by side with his employees in the vineyards he loved so much. The wedding of Richard and Clara was simple and intimate, held among the oldest vines on the property. Sophia, radiant in her flower girl dress, was the one who delivered the rings. During the vows, Richard moved, publicly thanked the girl. "Sophia, you were my first true friend when I needed you most. You taught me that limitations are just challenges to be overcome, and that true strength lies in love, not in control. I promise to be the best father I can be to you, every day of my life." The official adoption came a few months later, making legal what their hearts already knew. They were a family. At the launch of the winery's new premium vintage, now called Renaissance, Richard took the stage for a speech that many present would never forget. With Clara and Sophia by his side, he raised a glass of wine with his prosthetic, a gesture that once seemed impossible, now performed with confidence and grace. "This wine," he began, observing the ruby liquid, "is the product of a journey that began with pain and despair, but blossomed into hope and love. Like these grapes, which face storms and droughts, extreme cold and heat, we humans are also forged by our adversities." Richard paused, looking at Clara, whose eyes sparkled with pride and love, and at Sophia, who smiled openly. "For a long time, I thought I was strong because I controlled everything, but I discovered that true strength lies in recognizing our weaknesses and accepting help from those who truly care. Today, I am not just a man with prosthetics. I am a whole man because I have learned to love and be loved. Udik, and so the empire that Richard built not only became a reference in wines, but also a place where overcoming and love flourished like the vineyards that meant so much to him, where a single mother housekeeper and a millionaire found, in life's adversities, the path to a redemption that neither of them knew they were seeking.